So, Jonathan, thank you for granting me time in your beautiful house and your garden.
You're very welcome.
How has your past experience as a tree surgeon and forester shaped your approach to arboriculture?
I think one of the wonderful things about being a consultant when you have previously been a climber is you learn things when you're climbing that you will never learn from the ground. The way that branches behave, branches' strength, the strength of a horse chestnut branch compared to an oak branch is significant, which is not something that they tend to teach you in college, but it's certainly something you learn when you're in the trees. So the practical application of what I've learned as a climber, I did 8 years as a climber, climbing every single day. I was reasonably good for the equipment that we used in those days, which was 3-ply rope, no double roping systems, no fancy carabiner aids or anything, just simple tie a prusik knot and climb up the tree. And it got me very fit, which I didn't quite retain, but it taught me a lot about the structure of trees. It taught me a lot about the way trees grow and how they behave in different weather conditions. So it's a very important background, and if somebody applies to me for a job who's spent time as an arborist, climbing trees and working with trees physically, it's always a good tick box from my point of view. So much better than somebody who was a student who's learnt all they can learn from a college but has never had that practical experience. So I started climbing in 1979 and continued climbing until I got an office job in 1987. And since then I have climbed, usually in a legal case when I needed to get up to a branch union in a tree, but occasionally I've used mupes to get up to a specific point in the tree to look at the structure of the wound in the tree. So climbing is something I tend not to do nowadays, but I have the greatest respect for climbers. And if one applies for a job with us, we're quite often very happy to talk to them about it.
You worked as the senior arboriculturalist with a local authority.
Yes, I did 8.5 years as a senior arboriculturist at Bradford in Yorkshire, in the UK, and it's an incredibly difficult job. I've got a great deal of respect for tree officers. They have not just high workloads and often work in difficult conditions by people who dislike them. They'll have a member of the public who they're ringing in saying, I hate this tree outside my house, I want you to do this. And as a tree officer you have to have good interpersonal skills and be able to explain to people what the benefits of having that tree outside the house is all about, and having the strength of character to also say, no, I'm sorry, we're not going to cut the tree in half for you, we're going to leave the tree as it is, it's a perfectly fine tree. So I have a huge amount of respect for tree officers. I found it very difficult, particularly towards the end of my time as a tree officer, because there'd been council cuts and we'd gone down from 3 people to 2 people and then 1 person. And so whilst I was a senior, I was also the only tree officer in that department. And the reason that I decided I was going to leave the council, it was one particular case, I remember it really clearly. The leader of the council, who was a Conservative councillor, a lady, she was married to a very prominent solicitor in the Yorkshire area. They had offices all over Yorkshire. And I had a very good relationship with her, and she owned a lot of land all around the council. And I knew that they owned this particular woodland, and there was a stream down the middle of the woodland. They owned one side of the valley, which was beautiful oak, traditional Yorkshire oak and silver birch forest. And the other side of the valley was similar, but it was in a different ownership. And that ownership, the trees were under threat. And as a tree officer, I decided the best thing to do would be to get the support of my senior officers and make a tree preservation order which covered the whole woodland, not just the bit that's under threat, but the bit that belonged to the council leader's husband as well. So one afternoon I rang to speak to the lady councillor, and she wasn't in, and I explained to her husband, who I had met and had spoken to before, that we had this dilemma. I wanted to put a tree preservation order on the other side of the woods, and it was my intention to put a tree preservation order up their side of the woods as well. It was a large woodland for the Yorkshire standard, probably about 11 hectares, I think it was, I seem to remember, their part. And he thanked me for telling what we were going to do, and I left it at that. And then the weekend came, and he had a lot of his forest felled completely. He had contractors in with big machines, and he used privileged information from me as the tree officer, who contacted him out of respect and trust, and he basically felled all the level areas of the woodland because he intended at some point to build houses. So this put me in a dreadful position. I had to explain to all the press and to my bosses why I had spoken to this man, the council leader's husband, and it all got very political and very difficult, and I was placed in really difficult situation. And I thought to myself, there's no thanks for doing the job that I was doing to the best of my ability, and the downside of it was half of this woodland was cut down by somebody who I trusted. And so after that, I thought, I really need to start thinking about running my own business. I've been wanting to do it for a number of years, and that was the catalyst. 8.5 years at local authority in a senior tree officer level was enough for me, and I made the decision pretty much that week to leave.
You work as an expert witness with much experience in litigation work. Can you share some insights or advice for professionals who may find themselves in this situation?
Sure, yeah. I've literally lost count of how many hundreds of cases I've done. Most of them, of course, don't go to court, but several hundred have gone to court. And what I hear when I'm discussing these cases with other professionals, far too often, in my opinion, is the big mistake, I think, is they see it as a win or lose situation. So prominent arboriculturists have come to me and said, so you lost that one, or well done, you won that one. And for me, legal cases has nothing to do with losing or winning. Legal cases are, as an expert, you have to be impartial, you have to get to the bottom of the matter, you've got to thoroughly investigate that issue and find out the truth. And once you've found the truth, you can explain that truth to the court. One should never, in my opinion, at all, be tempted to what we call gild the lily a little bit, to put a little bit of spin on the situation and try and make it look a little bit better for your side. Because the judge will see through that, and he will understand what you're doing, and he will lose respect for you. So the biggest advice that I would give to anybody doing court work is always tell the truth, always stay within your realms of expertise. Never start to give an opinion on an engineering issue or a landscape issue or an issue which is not your specific skill. As long as you stick to that, there's no reason to ever be nervous about these cases. You're simply there to answer the questions truthfully. And that is my biggest advice to anybody doing this work. And I know a lot of people who do arboricultural reports but would never do a court case, and a lot of those people ask me to sort of get involved and do them. But if you're ever in that situation, you should always remember the most important thing is to tell the truth, and nothing but the truth.
In one of your interviews, you mentioned that you enjoy accident investigations. Can you share an example of that?
Yes, enjoy. I suppose you could call it enjoyment, really. I like to be faced with a new situation and to be given the trust and the time and the space to thoroughly look at the whole situation. View it completely holistically. Look at if it was an accident where somebody was hurt by a tree, look at the weather conditions, really look at the gusts, wind gust speeds, the wind direction, obviously very thoroughly investigate the tree itself and to come up with something that I truly believe is the case, and work out what happened on that day or that night or whatever that caused this tree to cause whatever problem it's caused. Quite often when I'm doing these, I'm working for people like the Health and Safety Executive or the police or the Crime Prosecution Service sometimes. These are all, of course, very serious professionals, and they expect complete truthfulness and complete thoroughness from ourselves. And I do get a certain amount of enjoyment from really drilling into the issues and working out what actually happened on that day. And being truthful about it, sometimes you say, this is what I really believe happened, but there is a chance that X, Y, or Z also was involved. But I do get a lot of satisfaction, I think is probably the better word, than enjoyment, out of thoroughly investigating and really writing down my report and going back to that report 2 or 3 days later and thoroughly reading it again and making sure I've covered every point, and that there's nothing in there that I can think, how could another person view that? And I always try and read the report from the point of view of the other side, the other expert that will no doubt be reading that report. So I do get a fair amount of satisfaction out of those sort of investigations, and I have done a lot of them. Again, hundreds of them.
As a chartered biologist and chartered arboriculturalist, what are some key developments or trends in these fields?
I try my very best to keep up to date with all new things which are happening in the industry, as we've been talking about earlier on today. All the things that we've been learning about today will go into the toolbox and will become very helpful things for me in future cases. And the more tools I put in that toolbox, the better I will be in the future. But I do enjoy the biological side of things. I read all the biological journals. I keep up to date with modern thought processes on how fungi interact with trees and how trees interact with one another, and I totally find it completely fascinating. And all the relationships between different beetles and butterflies and the natural worlds have always fascinated me from being a child. So I try and keep on top of all those sort of things. But of course, when you have a specific case, you do spend a lot of time honing in on a particular subject. So you may need to know about a particular beetle when it comes out of its exit hole from the tree, and I love all that. I'll sit down with a good book and read about all that.
You have advised private individuals, governments, royalty and celebrities. Can you share any experience from that, even without naming them?
We've done a little bit for one of the members of the royal family, where this individual had a large estate and was quite interested in the idea of direct sowing of tree seeds, which I was very interested in. And he did a project where he and we, with his foresters, decided on a species mix and a species density and how to prepare the ground. And we went and we direct sowed quite a number of hectares of predominantly oak, and watched that develop over probably about 15 years. And that was amazing. The germination levels were so good, much better than we ever thought they would be, that the density on the ground is the density that we would never think of planting at that density. And to give you an idea, when I went back at year 15, you simply would not have been able to walk from one side of the woodland to the other, even on your hands and knees. The trees were too close together, so obviously we had to do some thinning work. But the take on that was amazing. Obviously, you can't name these people in such situations, but it's always interesting doing work for these sort of people. We've worked for several rock stars, some pretty high-profile ones who are very shy people, and whose life I would not want to share, with security and cameras and night vision and heat sensing cameras around the houses at night, where if you're working in the woods, you'll get a phone call from a security guard saying, this particular person is going to take a morning walk. Can everybody leave the eastern side of the estate for 1 hour whilst they go for a walk? And you just go and either sit in your vehicle or go to a different part of the estate for 1 hour and 10 minutes until that person's had the walk. But one person I know that wouldn't mind the information being shared is, when I was younger, I was very into rock music. And there's a pop group called Def Leppard, and Ricky Savage was the lead guitarist and singer in Def Leppard, and he had a problem with his neighbour to do with trees, and he called me in, and it was a fantastic experience because we sort of went in a few times, but we looked at the problem that he had with his neighbour, the problem that his neighbour had with his trees, and we, over a period of time, solved that problem. But every time I went, he made a point of spending 1.5 hours with me. We went into his man cave, which involved pool tables, gaming stations, a fridge, a snooker table, music studio, and he always made me a bacon sandwich and a cup of tea, and I remember that very, very fondly.
You mentioned a desire to do more sculptures.
Yeah. At a time when nobody else really did chainsaw sculptures, I, messing about whilst I was a tree surgeon in lunchtimes, I started making shapes, and I've always been able to draw and had a little bit of artistic ability, so I started making owls and woodpeckers and things in my lunchtime, and people started coming saying, actually that's quite nice, could I buy one from you? So for a long time, even when I had stopped being a tree surgeon, I carried on doing chainsaw sculptures, usually as commissions, often for councils. So my speciality was to take a really big piece of wood and turn it into something in less than a day. So a lot of sculptors were very, very slow, but I had the confidence to take off big pieces and really make something significant in a short period of time, and people really liked that. So they were never finished off with great detail. They were never finally chiseled afterwards, but the feedback that I had from people really gave me a fantastic sense. Now, I've always been a Michelangelo fan. The guy was a genius. I know he was around at the same time as Leonardo da Vinci. And how one country, or one region, I think it was a region before it was a country, how Italy could produce two genius, or genii, in the same period, who can do such fantastic things, I don't know. There must have been something in the water at that time. But every time I'm traveling, if I'm in Italy or in Paris or in London, I always try and find the museums that have the sculptures. And I've got lots of books on sculpture. And it struck me that when I came to a point where I wanted to retire, I would go to Carrara and choose a large piece of marble and try and make my own David statue. It's not happened yet, but it's still possibly on my radar. The things I've usually done is animals, so squirrels, birds, of all different types of birds. I've done a wild boar. I did a rhinoceros for that was outside for the Rolls-Royce factory in Derby in the UK, which was a nice one to have. Totem poles. Pinocchio, I did a Pinocchio, which was stolen. I don't know how, but I did this large Pinocchio with arms coming out, long nose, and somebody cut it down and took it away, which is a shame. Foxes, all sorts of things like that. But if I was ever going to try and do a marble sculpture, I think it would be a human figure I would try and do. I'm really quite excited about trying that.
How do you approach staying updated on the latest development in arboriculture?
As a company, what we tend to do is because there's quite a few members of staff, If there are training courses 1 day, 2 days a week, all around the country and around Europe, but I have to think about the cost of that. So it's often cheaper for me to bring the specialist in for a day or 2 days, and that's what we've tended to do. So if we need to know about subsidence, we bring a specialist in for subsidence, talk to us for a couple of days. A soil specialist, we have them on a regular basis. And earlier on, we've had the expertise on some of the technology that you've been dealing with. So this is how we tend to do it. Although the various conferences that I go to, when interesting information is put to us, I will either disseminate that and pass it on to my staff, or I will give them links to the information when it becomes available, and try and keep them briefed on what's happening and what I think they should be learning about and getting better at. Grow the company almost as if it was a family. We, try to look after them very well, and treat them as if they were, treat them as equals, of course, and give them the respect that they deserve, and feed that information that's learnt back to them, and give them, they each have a training budget as well, some of which is used and some of which is not used. But there are some courses that we organise in-house which are not so much compulsory, but they're expected to do them. So JCA started in 1997 when I left the council for the reasons I explained earlier, and at the time it was just me. I worked for probably 6 months as just me from my house. At the time, in 1997, computers were only just really coming into the workplace. A Gateway 2000 computer in the year 2000, when we were all frightened of the millennium bug. I worked away learning keyboard skills on that. We were very early to take up on IBM's dictation software, because I learned that I wasn't particularly good at typing. And in those days, it was IBM or another company called Dragon Dictate, and you had to say each word separately, full stop, new paragraph, speak like this. But it worked fine for us. And at that time, I became quite busy. I had a lot of work coming in, so I employed a friend who was between jobs, and he said, I'll give you 6 months, and he came for 8 years. And during that time, we moved to the office that we're at now, and we developed very modern, for that time, and robust templates for everything that we did, and we spent a lot of time on development, and that got us to a level which allowed the company to become quite well known quite quickly, quite well respected. And we've now grown to a point, I think we've got 22 people working for us. We probably will try and stabilise at that, to be fair, because we're in the north of the UK. I won't say we've saturated the north of the UK, because we do have a lot of competitors, but we're at a comfortable place. I don't want to start employing personnel managers and human resource departments and things like this. 22 people is about right, I think.
During your term as a president of European Arboricultural Council in the challenging time of COVID, what were the prospects you encountered?
I took on the presidency of the EAC, I can't remember which year it was, but it's typically it was a 2-year stint that you did, and because of COVID I ended up doing a 3-year stint. The biggest challenge for me was having to learn to use all the different Teams, Zoom, WeChat, all the different systems that people use for online meetings. Now, online meetings were never really something that I particularly enjoyed, but it was quite surprising that you could actually get a 2-day meeting done in about 3 hours if you really focused on it. We had one AGM which was totally online, and that was very, very draining. Chairing a meeting with about 50 people from 26 different countries online was really quite a stressful event. So that was the biggest challenge. I think the highest point professionally that felt for me was the way that the Moscow meeting went. Moscow was a challenge in many ways, a difficult relationship with Russia at the moment with the EAC, but at that time the relationship was very good, and we had a really amazing meeting in Moscow with no problems with any of the budgets. Everything was sponsored. Everything flowed really well. Apart from having lost my luggage at the airport, and I did enjoy the process of being president. Working with the team at Bad Honnef was always interesting, always rewarding. Such lovely people, and then casting the eye further afield into the rest of Europe. You know, I just don't know anybody that's in the EAC that's not a nice person, basically. Nice people to deal with. Mm-hmm. But of course they're all pretty much volunteers, and the nature of volunteers is you can't say to them, you have to do this and you have to do it by Thursday next week. It's all very much a case of working on everybody's trust, working on everybody's goodwill. By and large it works, but sometimes things take a little bit longer than they would in a company like JCA, for instance.
And from your point of view, what's the main important mission of EAC for this period of time?
Well, for me, I've always been passionate about making sure that nobody's disadvantaged in arboriculture. So every country, no matter how big, how small, how rich or how poor, should have the same benefits from being involved with the European Arboricultural Council. We should make sure that the poorer countries get the translations and we give them financial support for that. We should make sure that a student from one of the poorer nations should always get the chance to do the exams and to raise themselves in the profession. And I also think that the fantastic work that you've done on the European standards, I want to spread that not just around Europe and make sure that every arborist gets the benefit of them, but I want to spread it further afield as well, because there's lots of countries in the world that will benefit from those. Because as we were talking earlier on, by and large, tree management is the same everywhere. Different challenges, different ways that trees grow, different climates, but by and large it's the same. And the trees have the same benefit no matter where they are. They give shade to us, they give oxygen to us, all the other many benefits. The benefits are listed in the front of every tree book that's ever been written, but sometimes they need repeating. Those are my passions within the industry, and the industry has been really good to me. I've enjoyed 43 years of working in arboriculture. I've got a few more left, and in that time I want to push these things to make sure that the standards are improved and the opportunities are improved for everybody and spread as far as possible, not just Europe but the rest of the world as well.
Lastly, as a leader in the field of arboriculture, what advice would you give to aspiring arboriculturists?
There are various bits of advice that I would give. I think the first one is to always be truthful with your clients and your colleagues and your staff if you're in that position where you employ people. To make sure that you're always open and honest with people is one of the biggest things which will help someone in their career. And that goes right through to the legal side of things, which if you've developed that habit of always being truthful with people and always being open with people, then you'll make a good expert witness, as long as you've learnt all the other things along the way. I would tell them to go on as many short courses as they can afford to go on, or as their boss will tell them to allow them to go on. I've always found that you could go and do a vocational training course that might last a year or 2 years or 3 years, but actually if you're working and then getting the chance to go and do a 2 or 3 day course, I always find that you get so much more from that, because you're interacting with what you're learning on site and learning in your job, and you're applying it in the classroom or in the workshops, and then bringing that back into the workplace. So I would definitely advise people to do that. Never take chances with your health. is another one. I lecture the staff on this, but particularly for a climber, of course, you've got to do what you're doing and then double check it. Once, when I was, it was the summer of probably 1982, something like that, I was just employed to take down large elm trees, dying of Dutch elm disease. And we were very fit young men in the team, and we were competitively taking trees down, which wasn't good. Who could do the most in a day? Who was the fittest? Who could climb the fastest? And it was a culture that one particular day led me to say to myself, right, that has to stop, and that has to stop now. And I was taking down a multi-stemmed large tree with probably 5 or 6 stems of 60 centimeters DBH. And I was tired, it was the end of the day, it was 80 degrees, I was sweating, and I cut the felling cut on one of the limbs, and I was just tired and confused. I started to cut the back and looked up and realized that it was the limb that I was tied, it was the stem I was tied into. Thankfully, I didn't get far with the back cut, but it really focused my mind and made me say to myself, you cannot take any risks in arboriculture. But I think overriding, the best thing that I could advise people to do is to really enjoy, because it's a wonderful profession to be in. It's full of wonderful people, lots of experiences to be had, and what can be better? Being outside in good weather, bad weather sometimes as well, but playing with trees, it's a perfect job.
Thank you so much.